You're fired. Right now. The words cut through the soft jazz and clinking glasses like a blade through silk, sharp, controlled, and impossible to ignore. Every head in the restaurant turned at once, drawn to the center of the storm, where Richard Hale stood in his perfectly tailored charcoal suit, his presence dominating the room without effort, his jaw set, his eyes cold enough to make the temperature drop 10 degrees. In front of him, Ava Carter stood frozen, a tray still trembling slightly in her hands, the faint stain of red wine spreading across the front of his jacket like a crime she hadn't meant to commit. The chandeliers above cast a golden glow across polished marble floors, reflecting wealth and power in every direction, but none of it touched her, not really, not the way it wrapped around him like armor. She had learned, long before tonight, that places like this were not built for people like her. They were built for men like him. Ava lowered her eyes instinctively, her fingers tightening around the edge of the tray as murmurs began to ripple through the crowd, quiet at first, then growing, like wind brushing across the surface of water before a storm. Someone whispered. Someone laughed under their breath. Someone leaned closer just to watch. I'm sorry, sir, she managed, her voice barely above a whisper, steady only because she forced it to be. Apologies came easy when you worked double shifts and still counted every dollar at the end of the week, when rent was always due and time was never enough. But Richard didn't respond to the apology. He didn't acknowledge it at all. Instead, he turned slightly, gesturing with 2 fingers, and the manager appeared almost instantly, as if summoned by the shift in air alone. Get her out of here, Richard said, his tone calm, measured, final. Not loud, not emotional, just absolute. The kind of voice that didn't need volume to carry authority. The kind of voice that ended things. Ava felt it before she processed it, the weight of it settling into her chest, pressing down on something fragile she had spent years learning how to protect. Around her, the restaurant seemed to lean in, the soft clatter of silverware slowing, conversations fading into a hush that wasn't silence, but something heavier, something expectant. The manager hesitated just a fraction of a second, then nodded quickly, stepping closer to Ava with a tight, practiced smile that didn't reach his eyes. Let's go, he muttered under his breath, low enough to pretend it was private, loud enough that it wasn't. Ava didn't move right away. Not because she wanted to resist, she knew better than that, but because something inside her needed a second longer to catch up, to hold itself together before it cracked in front of strangers. Her gaze dropped to the floor, to the reflection of the chandeliers and polished marble, to the small, almost invisible details that helped her breathe when everything else felt too loud. And that's when it slipped. The chain at her neck loosened, just slightly, just enough. A small silver pendant slid free, catching the light as it fell, hitting the marble with a soft, almost delicate sound that no one else seemed to notice. No one except him. Richard's voice stopped mid-breath. His eyes shifted, not to her face, not to the stain, but to the object resting between them on the floor. And for the first time that night, something in his expression changed. Not anger, not control, something else, something quieter, something dangerous in a different way. The room didn't understand it yet, but the air had already begun to shift. The pendant did not belong in a place like this, not among crystal glasses and $1,000 plates, not under chandeliers that cost more than Ava had earned in her entire life. And yet there it was, resting quietly on the marble, as if it had been waiting for this exact moment to be seen. Ava's breath caught for half a second before she quickly bent down, her movements small and careful, hoping to retrieve it before anyone else noticed, before it became another reason for judgment, another flaw to be pointed out under bright lights and colder eyes. But she was too late. Richard Hale had already stepped forward, not quickly, not dramatically, but with a deliberate stillness that drew attention without asking for it. His polished shoes stopped inches from the pendant, and for a moment, he did nothing at all. The manager beside Ava shifted uncomfortably, unsure whether to continue ushering her away or to wait for the unspoken command that now hung in the air like a suspended note. Richard crouched slightly, just enough to reach the object, and when his fingers closed around the thin silver chain, something in the room shifted again, subtle but undeniable, like the air before a storm changes direction. Ava straightened slowly, her heart beating harder now, not because of fear of losing her job, not because of the whispers that had begun again, but because of the way he was looking at that pendant, the way his expression had gone from controlled irritation to something she could not name. He turned it over in his hand, his thumb brushing across the worn engraving on its surface, and for the first time since he had spoken those cutting words, he seemed to hesitate. Not long enough for anyone else to question it, not long enough to break the illusion of authority, but long enough for Ava to notice. "Where did you get this?" he asked, his voice quieter now, still steady, still composed, but missing the sharp edge it had carried moments ago. The question landed differently than the command before it, less like a verdict and more like something unfinished, something searching. Ava blinked, caught off guard by the shift, her fingers instinctively reaching toward the pendant as if it belonged to her in a way she could not explain to anyone else in the room. "It was my mother's," she said, her voice soft but clear, each word chosen carefully, not to impress, not to defend, but simply because it was the truth. Around them, the restaurant had gone still again, the kind of stillness that did not come from silence but from attention, from people sensing that something had changed even if they did not yet understand what. Richard's gaze lifted from the pendant to her face, really looking this time, not as a customer looks at staff, not as a man looks at someone beneath his notice, but as if he were trying to place something that had been lost a long time ago. Ava held his gaze for only a second before lowering her eyes again, not out of submission, but out of habit, the kind built from years of knowing when not to be seen. "Your mother," he repeated slowly, the words almost to himself, as if testing them against something in his memory. His grip on the chain tightened slightly, and the faintest flicker of something crossed his features, something that did not belong to the man who had just ordered her dismissal. The manager cleared his throat, attempting to restore the rhythm of the moment. "Sir, I will handle this," he said, reaching toward Ava again, eager to move things along, to return the room to its previous balance where everything made sense and everyone stayed in their place. But Richard did not hand the pendant back. He did not step aside. Instead, he looked at Ava once more, his eyes sharper now, not with anger, but with focus, as if a door had opened in his mind, and he could not ignore what stood on the other side. "What was her name?" he asked, and this time, the room did not just listen. It held its breath. The question did not sound like an accusation, and that alone made it heavier than anything he had said before, because it carried something unfamiliar, something unsettled, something that did not belong to the man who had built an empire on certainty. Ava hesitated, not because she did not know the answer, but because the way he was looking at her made it feel like the answer mattered more than it should. The restaurant seemed to shrink around them, the soft glow of candlelight now too bright, the polished surfaces reflecting attention that no one dared interrupt. "Lillian Carter," she said finally, her voice steady, quiet, but grounded in something deeper than fear. The name settled into the space between them like a stone dropped into still water, sending ripples outward that no one else could see, but that Richard felt immediately, unmistakably. His fingers tightened around the pendant, and for a brief second, the control he wore so effortlessly slipped, not enough for the crowd to understand, but enough for the past to step forward uninvited. Lillian. The name was not unfamiliar. It was not distant. It was precise, sharp, like a memory he had buried under years of decisions and distance, under boardrooms and contracts, and a life that had no room for what came before. He had not heard it in over 2 decades, and yet it returned now with clarity that cut through everything else. Ava watched him carefully, her instincts telling her that something had shifted beyond her understanding, that this was no longer about a mistake, no longer about a job, no longer about a stain on an expensive jacket. This was something else entirely. She worked as a housekeeper, Ava continued, not because he asked, but because silence felt too heavy to carry alone. For a family downtown. She never talked much about before that. Her hands rested at her sides now, no longer trembling, her voice gaining a quiet strength that came from speaking about the one person who had given everything and asked for nothing in return. Around them, the manager shifted again, glancing nervously between Richard and the growing audience of silent witnesses, unsure how to regain control of a moment that had clearly moved beyond him. "Sir, if there is an issue, I can take her information and handle this privately," he offered, his tone careful, eager to restore order, to return everything to its proper place where questions like this did not exist. But Richard did not respond to him. He did not even acknowledge him. His attention remained fixed on Ava, on the way she stood, on the cadence of her voice, on the quiet resilience that did not match the image he had formed just minutes ago. "How old are you?" he asked, the question coming slower this time, measured in a way that suggested he was calculating something he had not expected to need. Ava frowned slightly, caught off guard again, but answered anyway. 22. The number landed harder than the name. It aligned too cleanly, too perfectly, with a timeline he had not revisited in years, a timeline he had chosen to leave behind because it was easier to build forward than to look back. 22 years. His mind moved quickly now, connecting fragments he had long separated, the pendant, the name, the age, the faint, almost imperceptible familiarity in her eyes that he had dismissed as coincidence. The room held its breath again, not understanding the calculation, but feeling its weight. Ava met his gaze this time, not lowering her eyes, not stepping back, because whatever this was, it no longer felt like something she needed to shrink from. "Is there something wrong?" she asked, and for the first time, her voice carried a question that was not about survival, but about truth. Richard Hale did not answer immediately. For the first time in a very long time, he did not have one ready. And in that silence, something began to unravel. The silence did not break. All at once, it stretched, thin and fragile, like something that could snap with the wrong word, the wrong movement, the wrong breath. And for a man like Richard Hale, who had built his life on control, on precision, on always knowing exactly what came next, it was unfamiliar in a way that felt almost dangerous. His eyes remained fixed on Ava, but now there was no trace of the earlier irritation, no sharp edge, no dismissive distance, only a quiet intensity that seemed to be searching for something deeper than what stood in front of him. 22. The number echoed again, louder this time, aligning with a memory he had tried to file away as something temporary, something that belonged to a different version of himself, a younger man who had made decisions quickly and left just as quickly when opportunity demanded it. Lillian Carter had been part of that chapter, a name tied to a time before wealth, before influence, before the world knew who he was. She had worked in a modest brownstone on the east side, and he had been there on business, brief, efficient, forgettable, or at least that was what he had told himself when he walked away without looking back. But memory had a way of reshaping itself when confronted with truth, and now it returned with details he had not expected to remember. The sound of her voice, the way she had spoken carefully but honestly, the quiet strength that did not ask for attention yet could not be ignored. Ava shifted her weight slightly, the tension in the room pressing against her from all sides, but she did not step back, did not retreat, because something in his silence told her that this moment was no longer about a job or a mistake. It was about something that neither of them fully understood yet. "If I have done something wrong, I will leave," she said, her voice calm, not defensive, not pleading, just clear, because dignity did not require volume, it required steadiness. The manager exhaled softly, almost relieved by her words, eager to seize the opportunity to restore order, to guide her away, to return the room to its usual rhythm where power remained unquestioned and lines remained clear. "Yes, that would be best," he added quickly, gesturing toward the exit again, but his words landed into nothing, into a space where Richard had stopped listening to anything except the quiet realization forming piece by piece in his mind. The pendant in his hand felt heavier now, not because of its weight, but because of what it represented, a connection he had never acknowledged, a consequence he had never faced. His thumb traced the edge again, slower this time, as if confirming what he already knew but had not yet spoken. "Your mother," he said finally, his voice lower, almost careful, as if the words themselves carried risk. "Did she ever mention who gave her this?" Ava's brow furrowed slightly, not in confusion, but in recognition of a question she had heard before, from relatives, from neighbors, from people who were curious about things that did not belong to them. "She said it was from someone who promised to come back," Ava replied, her tone steady, but there was something underneath it now, something shaped by years of unanswered questions, by a story that had never been completed. She stopped talking about him after a while. The words settled into the space between them, and this time, There was no room left for denial, no distance left to hide behind. Richard's breath slowed, just slightly, and for the first time since he had entered the restaurant, the world around him felt less important than the truth standing in front of him. He looked at Ava again, not as a waitress, not as an employee, not as someone who had made a mistake, but as someone who carried a past he could no longer ignore. And in that moment, the power he held in every other room, over every other person, felt suddenly irrelevant, because this was not a situation he could control, not with money, not with authority, not with a single command. The room remained silent, watching, waiting, sensing that something irreversible had begun, even if they did not yet understand what it was. And for the first time in a very long time, Richard Hale did not know how to move forward without looking back. The truth did not arrive like a sudden revelation. It settled slowly, piece by piece, into a space that had already begun to crack under its weight, and Richard felt it in the way his chest tightened, in the way the noise of the restaurant seemed distant now, as if the world had stepped back to give this moment room to unfold. He looked down at the pendant again, then back at Ava, and this time there was no distance left in his gaze, only recognition trying to take shape through years of denial. Ava did not move, but something in her posture shifted, not fear, not submission, but a quiet readiness, as if she had spent her entire life preparing for answers that might never come, and now that something was finally happening, she refused to look away. He said he would come back, she added, her voice softer now, not because she was unsure, but because the memory itself carried weight. My mother waited for a long time. The words were simple, but they landed with precision, cutting through the layers Richard had built around himself, forcing him to confront something he had never allowed to fully surface. He remembered the promise, vague at the time, easy to make when leaving felt temporary, when ambition spoke louder than consequence. He had not thought of what waiting would look like for someone else, had not considered what silence would become over months, then years, then a lifetime. The manager shifted again, clearly uncomfortable now, glancing toward other guests, toward the staff, toward anything that might return control to his hands, but control had already left the room. Sir, if there is a concern, we can resolve this elsewhere. He tried again, his voice tight, but Richard raised a hand slightly, not aggressively, not sharply, just enough to stop him. It was a small gesture, but it carried more authority than anything spoken earlier. Ava noticed it, the way everything seemed to pause at his command, but she was no longer focused on that. Her attention remained on him, on the questions behind his eyes, on the shift that she could feel, but not yet name. Did she ever tell you his name? Richard asked, and this time, the question carried something different, something almost fragile, as if the answer mattered in a way that could not be undone. Ava shook her head slowly. No, she said. She said names did not change what people choose to do. There was no bitterness in her tone, no accusation, just a quiet statement shaped by years of observation, by watching someone she loved carry disappointment without letting it define her. The room remained still, but the energy had changed again, no longer fueled by curiosity or judgment, but by something heavier, something that made even strangers feel like they were witnessing something they should not interrupt. Richard exhaled slowly, the first real break in his composure, and for a moment, he closed his eyes, not to escape, but to steady himself against a realization that had fully formed now, undeniable, irreversible. When he opened them again, they returned to Ava with a clarity that left no space for doubt. What is your full name? He asked, even though he already knew part of the answer. Even though the question itself was no longer about confirmation, but about facing what he had avoided for 22 years. Ava hesitated for only a fraction of a second before answering. Ava Lillian Carter. The name landed like the final piece of something long broken, fitting too perfectly to ignore. Richard's grip on the pendant loosened slightly, and for the first time, the weight he felt was not just from the past, but from the present, from the person standing in front of him, from the realization that this was not a coincidence, not a misunderstanding, not something that could be explained away. This was consequence. And for a man who had built everything by staying ahead of consequence, it was the one thing he had never learned how to face. The name did not echo, it settled, heavy and absolute, leaving no space for interpretation, no room for coincidence. And in that moment, the distance between who Richard Hale had been and who he had become collapsed into a single point in time that he could no longer step around. Ava Lillian Carter. The middle name alone carried more weight than anything else, a quiet tribute to a woman he had once known, once left behind, a name that had lived on without him, growing into something real, something standing right in front of him now. His breath slowed, but it did not steady, not completely, because this was not a situation that could be corrected with a decision or resolved with authority. This was something that had existed for years without his knowledge, or perhaps without his willingness to know. Ava watched him carefully, the silence stretching again, but this time it did not feel like uncertainty. It felt like revelation, like something that had been hidden was finally being seen, even if she did not yet understand what that meant. "Why are you asking me all of this?" she said, her voice calm but direct, not confrontational, just honest, because she had reached a point where questions felt more important than fear. Around them, the restaurant had gone completely still now. No pretense of normal conversation, no attempt to return to routine, only the quiet awareness that something significant was unfolding in a space that had been designed for control, not truth. Richard looked at her, really looked at her again, and this time he allowed himself to see what he had dismissed before, the shape of her eyes, the subtle familiarity in the way she held herself, the quiet strength that did not ask for recognition but demanded respect the moment it was acknowledged. It was not just the pendant. It was not just the name. It was everything. He took a slow breath, the kind that did not come easily, the kind that marked a shift from reaction to realization. "Because," he began, and then stopped, the word hanging incomplete, because for the first time in a very long time, he did not know how to say something that mattered without losing control of how it would be heard. The manager stepped forward again, unable to hold back any longer, his voice sharper now, edged with frustration masked as professionalism. "Sir, this is inappropriate for the dining room. We need to resolve this immediately. The staff member has already been dismissed." The word dismissed landed wrong this time, not as a routine action, but as something that now felt out of place, misaligned with the reality that had taken over the room. Richard did not turn toward him. He did not acknowledge the interruption. Instead, he reached forward slowly and placed the pendant back into Ava's hand, his fingers brushing hers for only a second, but long enough for something unspoken to pass between them, something that neither of them could fully define yet. "You are not dismissed," he said quietly, his voice no longer sharp, no longer commanding, but steady in a different way, grounded in something that did not come from power, but from recognition. The manager froze, confusion flickering across his face, his understanding of the situation unraveling in real time. Ava looked down at the pendant in her palm, then back up at him, her expression unreadable for a moment, not because she did not feel anything, but because she felt too much to show it all at once. "That does not answer my question," she said, and there was no fear in her voice now, only clarity, only the quiet insistence of someone who had lived without answers long enough to know their value. Richard nodded slightly, as if accepting something, not just her question, but everything it carried with it. The room remained silent, but the silence had changed again, no longer tense, no longer waiting for conflict, but waiting for truth. And this time, there was no way to avoid it. The air felt different now, heavier in a way that could not be explained by the room or the people or the quiet tension that had settled over every table. It was something deeper, something that existed between two people standing a few feet apart, connected by a truth that had taken years to surface and only seconds to change everything. Richard did not look away this time, because looking away would have been easier, and for once, he understood that easy was no longer an option. Ava stood still, her hand closing slightly around the pendant as if grounding herself, her posture no longer defensive, no longer uncertain, but steady in a way that came from facing something head-on rather than avoiding it. "You deserve an answer," Richard said finally, his voice lower now, stripped of the authority it had carried earlier, replaced by something quieter, something that did not command but acknowledged. The words did not fill the silence. They settled into it, deliberate and measured, and for the first time since he had spoken to her, they were not about control, they were about responsibility. Ava did not respond right away, but her eyes remained on him, unwavering, waiting, not impatiently, not angrily, but with a calm expectation that made it clear she would not accept anything less than the truth. Around them, the manager stood frozen, his role in the situation now completely unclear, the structure he relied on no longer applying to what was unfolding, while the rest of the room remained suspended in quiet attention, aware that this was no longer a scene, but something real. Richard drew a slow breath, the kind that carried weight, the kind that marked the moment before something irreversible was spoken. "I knew someone," he began, choosing each word carefully, not to soften it, but to make sure it was true. "A long time ago. Her name was Lillian." The name no longer sounded distant when he said it. It sounded present, immediate, as if time had folded in on itself to bring it back. Ava's fingers tightened slightly around the pendant, her expression shifting just enough to reveal that she felt the impact of the words, even if she did not yet fully understand what they meant. Richard continued, not rushing, not avoiding, because this was not something that could be said halfway. "I left," he said, the admission simple, direct, without excuse, because there was none that mattered now. "I told myself it was temporary. I told myself I would come back." He paused briefly, not to gather his thoughts, but because the truth itself required space. "I did not." The words hung in the air, unadorned, undeniable, and in that moment, the image of the man he had been and the man he had become no longer aligned. Ava's gaze did not break, but something behind it shifted, not shock, not disbelief, but recognition, as if pieces of a story she had carried without answers were beginning to form a shape she had not expected to see. "Are you saying," she began, then stopped, not because she did not know the question, but because saying it out loud would make it real in a way that could not be undone. Richard met her eyes fully now, not as a man above her, not as someone removed, but as someone standing on the same ground, facing the same truth. "I am saying," he replied, his voice steady but no longer guarded, "that I should have come back. And I did not." The room remained silent, but the silence was no longer about watching. It was about witnessing, about understanding that something far more significant than a simple confrontation had taken place. Ava looked at him for a long moment, her expression unreadable, not because she felt nothing, but because she was measuring something deeper than words, something that could not be decided in a single moment. The pendant rested in her hand, warm now from her grip, a small object carrying years of absence, years of waiting, years of unanswered questions. And as she stood there, facing the man who had unknowingly shaped her life long before this night, the space between them held more than just a revelation. It held the weight of everything that had not been said for 22 years, waiting to be faced, one truth at a time. The words did not crash into her. They settled slowly, like something she had always known but had never allowed herself to fully believe. And for a moment Ava said nothing, because silence felt more honest than anything rushed or incomplete. The restaurant still existed around them, the soft glow, the polished tables, the quiet presence of people who no longer pretended to look away, but it all felt distant now, like a backdrop that had lost its meaning. Ava's fingers tightened around the pendant again, not out of nervousness, but out of instinct, as if holding onto the one piece of truth that had never changed in her life. "You left," she repeated, her voice calm, but this time there was something underneath it, not anger, not yet, but a clarity sharpened by years of absence. "And you never came back." The words were not loud, but they carried, not because of volume, but because of what they meant, because of the space they filled between them. Richard did not flinch, did not interrupt, because there was nothing to interrupt, nothing to correct. It was the simplest version of the truth, and it was enough. Ava looked at him fully now, not as an employee, not as someone standing below him in a world defined by status, but as someone who had the right to ask what had never been answered. "Do you even know what that means?" she asked, her voice still steady, but no longer distant. "To promise something like that, and just disappear?" The question was not dramatic, not emotional in the way people expected, but it carried weight in a different way, the kind that came from lived experience, from quiet nights and unanswered questions, and a life built without something that should have been there. Richard exhaled slowly, the sound almost imperceptible, but it marked something shifting inside him, something he could not manage the way he managed everything else. "I know what it means now," he said, And there was no defense in his voice, no attempt to reshape the past into something more acceptable. It was not an excuse. It was an acknowledgement. Ava shook her head slightly, not in denial, but in disbelief at the timing of it, at the way realization had arrived only after it could not change anything that had already happened. Now, she repeated quietly, and for the first time, there was a hint of something sharper in her tone, not anger directed outward, but the edge of something long held back. That is convenient. The words landed clean, precise, not raised, not thrown, but placed exactly where they needed to be. Around them, the manager remained silent now, completely out of place in a moment that had moved beyond anything he understood, while the other guests no longer shifted or whispered, because this was no longer something to react to. It was something to absorb. Ava took a small step back, not retreating, but creating space, the kind of space that allowed her to breathe, to think, to stand on her own terms rather than within his presence. My mother waited, she continued, her voice softer again, but steadier than before. She never said anything bad about you. Not once. There was no accusation in that, but there was something heavier, something that spoke of a kind of grace that made the absence even more difficult to understand. Richard's gaze lowered briefly, not out of avoidance, but because for the first time, looking directly at her felt like looking directly at something he had failed to become. She deserved better than that, he said quietly. Ava nodded once, a small movement, but it carried finality, as if confirming something that had already been decided long ago. Yes, she said. She did. The pendant rested against her palm, its surface catching the light again, but now it felt different, not just a memory, not just a connection, but proof of something real that had existed without his presence. Ava looked at him one more time, not searching, not hoping, just seeing him for who he was in this moment. Not the man he had been, not the man he could be, but the one standing in front of her now. And in that space, between what had been said and what had not, the truth settled fully, quiet and undeniable, leaving behind only what each of them would choose to do with it. The space between them did not feel empty anymore. It felt defined, shaped by everything that had been said and everything that had not. And Ava could feel it clearly now, the weight of a truth that had finally surfaced but had arrived far too late to change the years that came before it. She stood still for a moment longer, her eyes steady on Richard, not searching for something from him, not expecting anything more, but making sure that what had just been revealed would not be misunderstood or softened by time. You say you understand now, she said quietly, her voice even, controlled, but grounded in something far deeper than emotion alone. But understanding does not undo anything. The words were not harsh, but they were final in a way that could not be argued, not because they were meant to hurt, but because they were simply true. Richard did not interrupt, did not attempt to respond immediately, because there was nothing in his experience that had prepared him for a moment like this, a moment where power had no place, where control meant nothing, where the only thing that mattered was something he could not change. Ava looked down briefly at the pendant in her hand, her thumb brushing lightly over its surface, a small, almost unconscious gesture, but one that carried years of meaning, years of holding on to something that had never fully made sense until now. She told me it was from someone who believed he would come back, she continued, her voice softening slightly, not out of weakness, but out of respect for the memory itself. I think she believed that for a long time. Richard felt that more than he expected, not as a sharp reaction, but as a quiet realization that settled deeper with every word, a realization that what he had left behind had not disappeared, had not faded, but had continued, had grown, had waited in ways he had never considered. The room remained silent, but it was no longer the kind of silence that watched. It was the kind that listened, that understood that something real was unfolding, something that could not be reduced to a simple resolution. Ava lifted her gaze again, meeting his eyes without hesitation. But I did not grow up waiting, she said, and this time there was strength in her voice that had nothing to do with defiance and everything to do with identity. I grew up learning how to stand on my own. The statement did not reject him, but it did not invite him either. It simply defined her, clearly and without apology. Richard nodded slowly, not because he had something to add, but because he recognized what she was saying, not just the words, but the life behind them, the choices that had been made in his absence, the resilience that had been built without him. "You should not have had to do that alone," he said, his voice quieter now, carrying none of the certainty it once had, only the weight of what could not be undone. Ava held his gaze for a moment longer, then shook her head slightly, not in disagreement, but in acknowledgement of something more complicated. "But I did," she replied, and there was no bitterness in it, only fact, only truth. The manager shifted again, uncertain, out of place, the structure he relied on completely irrelevant now, but he said nothing, because there was nothing left for him to control. Ava took a slow breath, the kind that steadied her, the kind that marked a decision forming, not rushed, not reactive, but deliberate. She glanced around the room briefly, at the tables, the guests, the environment that had felt so intimidating just minutes ago, and then back at Richard, her expression calm, resolved. "You asked me earlier why I am here," she said, her voice measured. "I am here because I work hard, because I earn my place, not because of anything that happened before tonight." The words were not defensive, they were defining, drawing a line that made it clear who she was and how she had gotten there. Richard listened, fully, without interruption, without trying to reshape what she was saying, because for the first time, he understood that this was not something he could influence, only something he could hear. Ava closed her hand around the pendant once more, then let it rest naturally against her palm, no longer gripping it tightly, no longer needing it to anchor her in the same way. "And whatever this is," she added, her eyes steady, "it does not change that." The statement settled between them, clear and complete, leaving no confusion about where she stood. And in that moment, as the reality of everything finally took its full shape, the power that once defined the room had shifted entirely, no longer centered on wealth or status, but on something far more difficult to face, something that could not be bought, controlled, or rewritten. It could only be acknowledged. The truth had settled, but it had not softened, and as Ava stood there, steady and unshaken, the balance in the room had shifted in a way that no one could ignore, not even Richard himself. For the first time in years, perhaps decades, he was not the one defining the outcome of a moment. He was standing inside it, without control, without advantage, and with nothing but the weight of what he had done and what he had failed to do. He looked at her, really looked at her again, and this time there was no distance left, no illusion of separation between their worlds, only the undeniable connection that neither of them could dismiss. "You are right," he said quietly, his voice carrying none of the authority that once filled it, only acknowledgement, only acceptance. "It does not change what you built. It does not change who you are." Ava did not react immediately, but something in her expression softened just slightly, not in forgiveness, not in acceptance, but in recognition that he was no longer trying to rewrite the truth. The difference was small, but it mattered. Around them, the restaurant remained still, but the energy had changed again, no longer tense, no longer uncertain, but focused, as if every person present understood that something meaningful was unfolding, even if they could not fully grasp it. Richard took a small step back, not retreating, but creating space, mirroring the boundary Ava had already set, and in that simple movement, there was something new, something unfamiliar for a man like him. "Respect. But it does change something for me," he continued, his voice steady, deliberate, each word chosen with care, not to persuade, not to justify, but to be clear. "It changes what I have to face." The words were not dramatic, but they carried weight, because they were not about her, they were about him, about a responsibility he could no longer avoid. Ava listened, her posture unchanged, her gaze steady, not moved by words alone, but not dismissing them either, because she understood the difference between what was said to impress and what was said because it had to be. Richard glanced briefly at the manager, who stood frozen, unsure whether to step forward or remain invisible, then back to Ava, his focus returning fully to her. "No one here will question your place again," he said, his tone calm but firm, not commanding, but certain in a way that did not rely on power, but on decision. The manager straightened immediately, nodding without hesitation, the shift in authority unmistakable, but Ava did not respond to that, because that was not what mattered to her. She had already made that clear. "That is not why I stayed," she said quietly, her voice even, not rejecting his words, but placing them where they belonged, secondary to something else. Richard nodded once, acknowledging the point without argument, because he understood now that this was not something he could fix with a single action or a single promise. Some things required more than that. Some things required time. The silence returned, but it was no longer heavy, no longer uncertain. It was reflective, giving space to what had been said and what had yet to be decided. Ava looked at him for a long moment, her expression thoughtful now, not guarded, not distant, but measured, as if she were considering something beyond the moment, beyond the room, beyond everything that had just unfolded. "You cannot undo the past," she said finally, her voice soft but steady, carrying a clarity that had been present from the beginning. "But you can decide what you do with it now." The statement did not offer forgiveness, but it did not close the door either. It simply defined the reality of what stood between them. Richard held her gaze, understanding the weight of those words, understanding that this was not a resolution, not an ending, but the beginning of something far more difficult, something that would require more than acknowledgement, more than regret. It would require change. And for a man who had built everything on control, on certainty, on always knowing the next move, this was something entirely new. Ava shifted slightly, her posture relaxed but grounded, her presence no longer defined by the room or the situation, but by herself. The pendant rested quietly in her hand, no longer a question, no longer a mystery, but a piece of truth that had finally found its place. And as the moment settled fully into what it was, not a confrontation, not a mistake, but a turning point, the room remained silent, not because it had nothing to say, but because it understood that some moments did not need noise. They needed space. The moment did not end with a decision. It lingered, suspended between what had been revealed and what had yet to be earned, and Ava could feel that clearly now, the difference between hearing something and believing it, between acknowledging truth and accepting what came with it. She stood with a quiet stillness that did not come from hesitation, but from control, from knowing exactly where she stood even when everything around her had shifted. Richard remained where he was, no longer commanding the room, no longer directing its rhythm, but standing within it, present in a way that did not rely on power, only on awareness. The distance between them was no longer defined by status or circumstance, but by something far more difficult to navigate, something that could not be measured in steps or space. Ava glanced briefly toward the exit, not as an escape, but as a reminder of the world beyond this moment, the life she had built independently, the routine that had nothing to do with him, the identity she had formed without his presence. Then she looked back at him, her expression composed, thoughtful, and certain. "You said it changes what you have to face," she said, her voice calm, carrying neither doubt nor acceptance, only clarity. "But facing something is not the same as fixing it." The words were not a challenge, but they were not gentle either. They were precise, grounded in reality, leaving no space for interpretation. Richard nodded slowly, absorbing the weight of what she said, because it aligned with what he already understood, even if he had not yet found the words for it. "I know," he replied, his voice steady, without resistance. "And I am not expecting it to be." There was no hesitation in his tone, no attempt to soften the truth, and that, more than anything, marked the shift in him. Ava studied him for a moment longer, not searching for an answer, but measuring something deeper, something that could not be proven in a single conversation. Around them, the restaurant had begun to breathe again, softly, cautiously, as if unsure whether it was allowed to return to normal, as if the space itself had been changed by what had taken place. The manager moved slightly, signaling quietly to the staff, restoring movement without drawing attention, but even that felt different now, less controlled, less absolute. Ava took a small step back, not retreating, but grounding herself fully in her own space, her own decision, her own life. "I have a shift to finish," she said, her voice even, not dismissive, not cold, but clear in a way that left no confusion about her priorities. The statement was simple, but it carried weight, because it reaffirmed everything she had already said, everything she had already shown. She was not defined by this moment. She was not waiting for it to resolve her life. Richard listened, and for a second, something like surprise crossed his face, not because of what she said, but because of how she said it, because of the way she chose to remain grounded in her reality rather than be pulled into his. He nodded once, a small, respectful acknowledgement. Of course, he said quietly. There was no attempt to stop her, no attempt to extend the moment beyond what it was, and that restraint spoke louder than anything else he could have done. Ava turned slightly, preparing to step away, but paused just long enough to look at him one more time, not with expectation, not with judgment, but with something more balanced, something that recognized both what had been revealed and what remained unresolved. "This does not change who I am," she said, her voice soft but firm, repeating the truth in a way that left no room for misunderstanding. Richard met her gaze and nodded again, this time with more certainty. "I understand," he replied. And for the first time, it sounded like he truly did, not because he had the answer, but because he had accepted the question. Ava turned and walked back toward the service area, her steps steady, unhurried, her posture unchanged, as if nothing about her had shifted, even though everything around her had. The pendant rested against her hand, then slipped gently back beneath her uniform as she moved, no longer something she needed to hold on to in the same way. Behind her, Richard remained still, watching, not as a man observing someone beneath him, but as someone witnessing something he could not claim, something he would have to earn if it was ever to exist. The room gradually returned to motion. Conversations resumed in low tones, glasses clinked again, but the atmosphere had changed in a way that would not fully disappear. And as Ava continued her shift, moving through the same space that had once felt overwhelming, she carried herself with the same quiet strength she always had, unchanged by revelation, grounded in truth, and defined by something that had never needed his presence to exist. The restaurant slowly returned to its rhythm, but it was no longer the same rhythm, not for those who had witnessed what had unfolded, and certainly not for the two people now moving within it on entirely different terms than before. Ava carried a tray through the dining room with steady hands, her movements practiced, precise, unchanged on the surface, but there was a quiet shift beneath it all, not in who she was, but in what she now knew. Each step she took was deliberate, grounded in the same discipline that had carried her through years of uncertainty, and as she moved from table to table, her presence remained calm, composed, untouched by the weight of the revelation in a way that made it clear she had already decided something important. She would not let this moment redefine her. Across the room, Richard remained seated now, no longer standing at the center of attention, no longer the figure that commanded immediate response from everyone around him. For the first time in a long time, he was still, not because he chose to be, but because he did not yet know what the next step should be. His untouched glass sat in front of him, the surface reflecting the soft light above, but his focus was not on the table, not on the room, but on the quiet realization that had settled into him with a weight he could not ignore. He watched Ava as she worked, not with ownership, not with expectation, but with a kind of awareness that felt unfamiliar, as if he were seeing something for the first time that had always existed beyond his reach. The manager approached cautiously, his posture careful, his voice lowered as he leaned in slightly. "Sir, should we make any adjustments regarding her position?" he asked, the question shaped by habit, by a system that expected clear direction and immediate resolution. Richard did not respond right away. He did not look at the manager. His gaze remained on Ava, on the way she moved through the space without hesitation, without seeking acknowledgement, without altering her behavior to match the attention she had just received. That alone told him more than any explanation could. "No," he said finally, his voice quiet but certain. "She keeps her position exactly as it is." The answer was simple, but it carried intention, not as a reward, not as compensation, but as respect for what she had already earned on her own. The manager nodded quickly, relief flickering across his face as he stepped back, grateful for clarity even if he did not fully understand it. Ava approached another table, placing down a dish with care, offering a polite nod to the guests, her tone warm but professional, unchanged in a way that made it clear she was not performing. She was simply continuing. The world had shifted, but she had not lost her footing within it. Richard leaned back slightly in his chair, his hands resting still, no longer driven by the instinct to control every detail around him. Instead, He allowed himself to observe, to process, to understand that this moment was not about immediate action, but about something longer, something that would require consistency rather than command. Ava finished serving the table and turned, her path naturally bringing her back toward the service area. But as she passed by his table, she did not stop, did not pause, did not acknowledge him in any way that suggested obligation or expectation. She simply continued, her focus on her work, her pace steady, her presence self-contained. And in that brief passing moment, Richard understood something with complete clarity. Whatever existed between them now was not something he could claim. It was something he would have to earn, if it could be earned at all. The realization did not come with frustration. It came with acceptance, with the understanding that some things were not meant to be resolved quickly, not meant to be controlled, but meant to be approached with patience, with humility, with time. The room continued around them, voices rising and falling, glasses meeting softly, the ordinary returning in layers, but beneath it all, something had changed permanently. Ava stepped back into the service area, setting down her tray, taking a brief breath before moving again, her expression calm, her mind clear, her sense of self untouched by the weight of what had been revealed. And at his table, Richard Hale sat quietly, no longer the center of the room, but a man who had just been introduced to a truth he could not ignore, and a responsibility he could not delegate, one that would not be measured in wealth or influence, but in something far more difficult to prove, something that would take time. The night moved forward, but something within it remained suspended, a quiet shift that lingered beneath the surface of ordinary motion, unnoticed by most, but impossible to ignore for the two people whose lives had just intersected in a way neither of them could reverse. Ava finished her shift the same way she had begun it, with discipline, with focus, with a quiet strength that did not demand recognition, and as she tied her apron strings loose and set them aside, her movements were steady, unhurried, as if this night had not shaken her, only clarified something she had always known. The staff around her resumed their routines, exchanging small talk, counting receipts, preparing for closing, but even in those familiar actions, there was a subtle awareness that something unusual had taken place, something that would be talked about later in quieter voices, with uncertainty and curiosity. Ava did not engage in any of it. She stepped into the hallway leading toward the exit, the softer lighting casting long shadows against the walls, her footsteps light but certain, each step carrying her away from the room where everything had changed and yet, in the most important ways, nothing about her had. As she reached the door, she paused briefly, not out of hesitation, but out of instinct, her hand resting against the cool metal handle, her fingers brushing lightly against the pendant now tucked safely beneath her uniform. For a moment, she closed her eyes, not to escape, but to center herself, to acknowledge what had happened without letting it define what came next. Then she opened them and stepped out into the night air, the cool breeze meeting her skin with a clarity that felt grounding, real, untouched by the weight of the room she had just left behind. Inside, Richard remained seated long after the last course had been cleared, long after the final guests had left, the restaurant now quiet in a way that felt entirely different from before, not filled with tension, but with reflection. The lights dimmed gradually, the staff moving efficiently around him, but no one approached, no one interrupted, as if they understood that this was not a moment to disturb. He sat there with nothing in front of him now, no distractions, no obligations, only the space to think, to process, to confront something he had avoided for years without realizing it. The image of Ava walking away stayed with him, not as a loss, not yet, but as a realization, as a clear understanding that whatever existed between them would not be defined by what he could offer, but by what he was willing to become. He had built everything in his life through control, through decisions made quickly and executed without hesitation, but this was different. This required patience. This required humility. This required time in a way he had never allowed himself to consider before. Outside, Ava walked down the sidewalk, the city lights stretching out in front of her, the sounds of distant traffic and passing conversations blending into a familiar rhythm that felt steady, predictable, hers. She did not look back, not because she was closing a door, but because she did not need to. Whatever needed to happen next would not come from turning around. It would come from moving forward. The pendant rested quietly against her chest now, no longer a question, no longer a symbol of something missing, but a piece of her story that had finally been completed, even if what came after it remained unwritten. And somewhere behind her, in a room that no longer held the same meaning it once did, Richard Hale sat with a truth that had stripped away every illusion of control he had relied on, leaving behind something far more difficult to face. The night carried on, unchanged for the world, but for them. It had marked a beginning, not of resolution, but of responsibility, not of answers, but of choices. And in that quiet, undeniable shift, something had been restored, not through power, not through wealth, but through the simple, unshakable presence of dignity, standing where it had always belonged. In that night, without a single word spoken to the world, something far more powerful than authority revealed itself in silence.